In this video, I'm going to talk about two main topics. One of those topics is how our Mainnet protocol launch is going to work, like what the actual events are and what they mean, and some more details about that, about how the token unlocking is going to happen, etc. The other thing I'm going to talk about is my perspective on the Reserve project. How do I think it's going, and what do I think of what's happened so far, and how do I imagine it developing from here? So let's start by taking a look at the Reserve app. I think that this gives some good context on really what it is that we've been focusing on as a team for the past year, a little bit more. So when we open the Reserve app, what we see is something very simple, and that's intentional. You have to remember that this is a piece of software we built for people who wanted to use US dollar stablecoins as ordinary money. So we tried to make it as much like an ordinary US dollar wallet as possible. And so if I want to send some money, let's say I want to send $5, I can just select a contact. And there we go. I've sent the $5. And I can invite people to join me in the app. You can see about 381,000 people have created accounts at this point, 34 of my personal contacts. And the magic of the app is kind of hidden in these two buttons. So here's my main account balance. And it's with these two buttons that I can deposit and withdraw money to or from Reserve. And if you look at these different methods, you can see there's a lot of different methods, right? It's very different from like a normal bank account. And so that's kind of the magic of what the Reserve team on the app side has built. If you look at these top withdrawal mechanisms, for example, you see on the right-hand side that all of these, you see an exchange rate in Venezuelan bolivars for each of these different withdrawal methods. So these are 4 popular Venezuelan banks, and then Pago Móvil, which is kind of like an interbank transfer mechanism in Venezuela. It's a little bit like Zelle, if you're familiar with Zelle in the US, but for Venezuelan bolivars. So you can withdraw to any of those through any of those methods. You can withdraw Argentine pesos, so you see a different exchange rate if you're withdrawing into Argentine pesos, and that works for any bank in Argentina. You can withdraw US dollars in the Panamanian banking system, and you see that there is basically a 3% fee there. You see that in the exchange rate. You can make an ACH transfer, so like a US dollar withdrawal to an American bank account here with that method under Banesco Panama. You can move money to Uphold in US dollars. You can withdraw Colombian pesos. So again, you see the Colombian peso exchange rate. And then there's a number of withdrawal mechanisms in crypto. So of course you can withdraw RSV on chain, and then you can also withdraw Bitcoin, USDT, USDC, and DAI. And then recently the team added the ability to withdraw Axie Infinity tokens and also to deposit. That's something that'd be more commonly used as deposit because there are several Axie Infinity players in Venezuela. I believe it's the second most popular country for Axie Infinity. So you can earn the tokens and then convert them into US dollars right in our app. So I just want to show you what the experience of making withdrawal is actually like. So you can imagine, that you live in Venezuela or Argentina and you've stored your money in dollars in order to escape inflation. And then now it's time to go make a purchase. And as I'll talk about in a minute, there's many places where you can now just make purchases directly with the Reserve app, which is super cool. But if the place you want to make a purchase doesn't accept Reserve yet, how do you do that? Well, you can make a withdrawal to your fiat account and then just pay directly from your fiat account right after that. So let's make a withdrawal to a Banesco account. Let's say I just want to withdraw, $10. So it shows me right there that I'm going to get 45.2 bolivars for making this withdrawal given the current exchange rates. And I'll select an account that I already have connected. And so now my transaction is processing. I'll go ahead and view the state of the transaction. And so it tells me that it's been assigned and now it's been completed. So you can see how fast it is to withdraw US dollars into Venezuelan bolivars. And so those Venezuelan bolivars actually have landed in that bank account. That transfer, because of the way that we provide liquidity with many of these different banking systems, these transfers are often pretty quick. And once the transfer is made, those funds are available in that account. So you can see, if you imagine, we could have been standing in a grocery store and decided, okay, I want to make a purchase in Venezuelan bolivars, and I'm there and I have my card. And so you can make a withdrawal and the funds hit your account that quickly. And then at that point, you can just swipe your card and make a payment in order to make a purchase in Venezuelan bolivars. And even though the Venezuelan bolivar or the Argentine peso are volatile and can lose their value, they don't lose their value in 5 minutes. And so if you make that withdrawal, even if you do it before you go to the grocery store, the fact that you then don't have to hold that local currency means that you can basically just live your life in dollars, even if you're making transactions in those local currencies. So this user experience was something we focused on quite a lot to make it that quick, because we wanted to make sure that the Reserve app as a service was really useful to ordinary people, even before we had tons of merchants accepting it. Even before you could go and pay directly with Reserve everywhere in the country, you can already live your life with the Reserve app and save your money in US dollars and just convert back into your local currency on the fly anytime you need to. So now let's look at what happened on the back end and talk about that a little bit. How did that happen so quickly? So here you can see a backend interface, an admin interface. One of these 10 RSV transactions is probably ours. And so here, this is kind of like the overall, like the overview of what's happening in the background. And so you can see all the different transfer mechanisms that we talked about available here. And then you can just see the stream right here of buy and sell, or deposit and withdraw transactions that are happening. You can see that a lot of these are pretty small, right? People are often doing pretty small transactions because we're serving a lot of ordinary people. And I have some of the fields here hidden to not show you any sensitive customer information. So you don't get to see all the detail, and I'm not going to open any one of these up. But basically, this backend interface is something that you might never see if you're an ordinary Reserve user, or even if you're part of our community, because it's really something that only our liquidity providers plug into. This isn't a public website. So liquidity providers in the Reserve network are essentially foreign exchange trading desks that have already operated in the countries that we're working in. And we vet those parties, and we make sure that they're trustworthy, that they run a good business, and so on. And then they're the ones processing these transactions. And as you can see, there's a number of different liquidity providers plugged in to do buying and selling in these different transaction methods. So it's actually become a pretty decentralized process, and that was intentional. It's not the case that the company that started Reserve is the one providing liquidity, for example, in Argentine pesos or Venezuelan bolivars. There's actually a whole bunch of independent trading desks that are doing that, and they're all plugged into this system. And over the course of time, we've automated this more and more. So this claiming board section used to be in use a whole lot more for manual transactions, where transactions would show up here, and liquidity providers that are using this interface would be able to manually click and select that transaction and go through the process of clearing it with the user. These days, a lot of the transactions just get assigned automatically, so you only see things show up here every once in a while if it's a transaction type that hasn't been fully automated yet. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of a view into the background of how this works. And you can see with this number of completed transactions, we've completed a little over 3 million total transactions through this system, and that's not counting just direct transactions where people are paying directly with Reserve. Currently, the Reserve app is live in Argentina, Venezuela, Colombia, and Panama, and there are 2 more countries that are in the works, also in Latin America. In terms of the number of users, we have about 100,000 weekly active users. About 100,000 people per week uniquely come and visit the Reserve app to do something or other. Those 100,000 people are doing about 575,000 transactions per month at this point. And that total transaction volume comes out to about $60 million worth of transaction volume. And the way that's broken down is about 40 million of that is business or institutional volume, and about 20 million of that is consumer volume. And we've seen the consumer volume continue to grow pretty significantly over the past few months as more and more consumers adopt the app, especially in Venezuela, but also in those other countries. We've also seen some interesting growth in Colombia recently. And we recently surpassed the milestone of 8,000 merchants directly accepting Reserve as a means of payment, which is pretty awesome. So you can pay online in a bunch of places. You can also pay directly in the store. And people just use the app itself. So you just take out the app and scan the QR code with the merchant that you're paying at. That started as many small merchants because there's very low barrier to entry. They can very easily adopt a new way of getting paid. But we've started to see interest in larger and larger merchants as well, and we're starting to see some interest in some large chains, which is pretty cool. I also want to talk about the team size. The team has grown incredibly. So first off, we break the organization down into two tribes, the R token tribe and the RPay tribe. And the R token tribe is focused on the protocol and other things that have to do with the crypto ecosystem and getting R tokens into circulation inside and outside of the Reserve app. And the RPay tribe, RPay is the name of the Reserve app that we use internally. So the RPay tribe is focused on building and operating and deploying the Reserve app. And as you can see from this chart, the RPay tribe is significantly larger. And that represents the fact that that's the main thing that we've been focused on until recently starting to divide our focus and focus on both of these areas at the same time. So to give you a sense of the size of the organization, you can see in the RPay tribe, we have 4 on design, 74 on operations. That's a lot of the stuff that happens in the background to keep our app running smoothly and transactions being processed and customers being taken care of. Customer experience, this team is sort of optimizing the process of taking care of our customers, business development, community, product, and engineering. Gives you a rough breakdown. And then on the R token side, we have compliance. The compliance team actually spans both areas of the organization. We have 26 on compliance, 4 on administration, 5 on engineering, 1 on business development, and 4 on community. And the R token tribe is going to be growing significantly this coming year because we have a whole lot of work to do in going to market and making the Reserve protocol available and the R tokens available in many different venues. And if you scroll down, you can see a whole bunch of different squads. These are the actual working configurations, and you can actually zoom in and check out the name and the description of these squads. I'm not going to do that now, but the page that I'm viewing is actually public on our website. So you can go to our website, check out the project page. If you go to squads, then you can actually see this org chart and zoom into it like I just was and actually get a picture of what we're working on. You can see how we've broken down our team, and that really gives you a sense of what it is that we're prioritizing as a team. Now, what do those numbers mean? They mean that phase 1 of the Reserve project is really working. And I'm incredibly excited about that. You spend a lot of time at the beginning of a project like this in the world of ideas, trying to do things, not sure if things make sense, not sure if things are going to work. And it's very exciting to be to the point in the project where, at least for phase 1, we can really see it working. We can really see it growing. And that's exciting in part because we're beginning to really touch the lives of a meaningful number of people. That's something that means a lot to me, and I know means a lot to pretty much everybody on our team. And there's nothing like taking something that's an idea where you don't know if it's even feasible. You have to take the risk of trying it in the first place and getting to the point where, at this point, tens of thousands, a little over 100,000 people are regularly benefiting from what was originally just a speculative idea. So I'm really excited to be to that level for phase 1 of the project. And in terms of the actual value and emotional impact on those end users, I think it's hard for me to sit here in the studio and tell you about that and have that make sense. Our team is working on another video where some of the people who use the service talk about it, and I think that will hopefully get the point across better than I can right here, right now. But suffice it to say, we hear all the time from our users that this is a meaningful piece of their financial life, that it's not just an app that is a little bit convenient, that it's something that is quite meaningful. And that's why we designed phase 1 of the Reserve project the way we did. We decided that we wanted to make crypto useful as money to people in the countries that we thought would benefit from that the most. Some countries in the world that we thought really needed that. And we've done it. And obviously this effort has almost nothing to do with me at this point. I helped get this all started, but the vast majority of the work and solving all these different problems has been done by other people on the team. And I'm incredibly proud and thankful and grateful and impressed at everything that we've done so far to get to this point. It's really been quite amazing. Well, let's step back and look at the even bigger picture of what Reserve is about, what the long-term objective is. The idea is to enable universal access to stable currency. Right now, the project has been focused on offering basically access to US dollars to people in parts of the world that suffer from high inflation and that don't already have free and easy access to an external currency like US dollars. But in the long term, what if the US dollar really does end up having problems? It's no longer a solution for people in those places. And if the US dollar really does have problems, then it's not even a good alternative for people in the US and other countries that use it as their main currency. So in order to provide stable, non-fiat cryptocurrency access to anyone in the world, you need to create that currency, or many of them, and there also needs to be at least one good platform for using crypto as money. And so RPay, the app that we just looked at a demo of, while it's currently mainly used in Venezuela and Argentina and other countries in Latin America, the intention is for it to be accessible globally and usable in the US and Europe and Asia and so on and so forth, so that anyone who wants to start using a dollar alternative, once that's something that we are able to offer in the app, once those currencies exist, will have an easy way to do so. And in terms of how that dollar alternative is intended to work, for anyone who doesn't know, the basic idea is a basket-backed token, a token that's backed by a quite diverse array of tokenized assets. Probably not pure cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin or ETH, because we believe that in the near term they'll continue to be quite volatile. Probably tokenized real-world assets, things that already exist but could be brought into the world of blockchain and made easier to aggregate together and sort of handle as a single token in this new and interesting financial ecosystem. As for the question of exactly which assets should be in the basket, that's not something that we have fully determined. We believe it's possible to create a very diversified basket of assets and to reach a level of stability that would be acceptable for a currency. But which assets get tokenized and are available on chain is an open question over the coming 5-10 years, and so that will play a major role in what ends up backing these different non-fiat currencies that are composed of different baskets. And as we'll probably talk about later in this video, we've structured the Reserve protocol to allow for the exploration of many different baskets. It's not that there will only be one non-fiat currency. We actually have structured the protocol as a platform where many different stablecoins can be deployed with different baskets and even with different governance systems to approach the problem of governing a basket-backed currency in a decentralized way from many different angles. And we think that that type of open exploration over the course of probably many years is actually what's necessary to reach this quite ambitious goal that we've laid out for the project. When I think about my imagination of how this could be in the future, I imagine the possibility of, let's pretend that there is a stable non-fiat currency that doesn't lose its value at all over the course of time. So there is no price inflation, generally speaking, happening with this currency. Imagine if everyone were using that, right? Imagine if you and your friends and your family and people in your country used that stable currency, what that would mean. Imagine that you could do some work and earn some money and tuck that money away and know that no matter how long you waited before you went to spend that money, to have someone provide something of value back to you, you would get the same amount of value as the work that you had done. And obviously this is a more urgent problem in some countries that have very high inflation on an annual basis. But even in countries that have low inflation of 2 or 3%, imagine the possibility that you could earn some money and you could tuck that money away and give it to your grandchildren. And 50 or 60 or 70 or 80 years after you earned the money, they could choose to finally spend it. And imagine if the thing that they spent it on, they got just as much value as you had put in to your work to earn that money that many years later. It almost doesn't feel right to call that money, because it's almost like we have baked into our idea of money that it loses its purchasing power over time. You know, everybody, even in countries that have sort of the most stable money, will talk about how, like, oh man, you know, remember what rent used to cost back in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s? You know, whenever you hear about prices from the past, it's sort of this magical time when, you know, these units of currency you're holding in your hand could have bought so much more. And when you think about that, it's like there sort of wouldn't have been a simple way to hand money down through generations and have it maintain its purchasing power. You'd have to do something much more complicated. So I really like that idea of being able to have a currency where you do some work, you earn some money, you tuck it away, and then you can sort of just chill. You just know that it's going to stay the same over the course of time. And I think that feeling of being able to just chill and not worry about the devaluation of your money, it's something that is, again, obviously a bigger deal in countries that have high inflation, and that's why we started as a project focusing on those parts of the world that suffer from this much more than others. But I really do feel like it is applicable globally. And if we do manage, or not necessarily we, but if people using the reserve technology over the course of time end up managing to construct alternate currencies that are not fiat-based, that have that long-term stability, I think it could be a really big deal for a lot of people and a lot of economies. When I think about how long it would take for that to happen and whether that really is going to happen, I mean, first off, I should note that obviously there are lots of things that have to go right for this plan to work. And we have acknowledged all along that, you know, there are many pieces that we didn't have figured out at the beginning of the project. We've made some progress, we've figured out some pieces, but there's still some pieces that have to be figured out, including the details of how decentralized governance of such a system really needs to work, and the details of which assets are appropriate to back such currencies. And there's a whole complicated tangle of what governments will allow to be tokenized and to be traded openly on decentralized venues. So there's quite a lot of risk still in sort of the question of whether this picture I'm painting is going to come true. But with that caveat out of the way, like, how long would it take? I mean, for some reason, I don't really know, but I tend to think about this on like a 30-year time scale. I tend to think about over, you know, if you think about over the first, I guess, what is it, about 12 years of Bitcoin, if you think about the amount of cultural change that's happened around money and around cryptocurrency, it's not insignificant. It's actually pretty meaningful. If you think back to, you know, sort of how people thought about these things before Bitcoin existed at all compared to how they think about them now, there's some notable cultural shift. And if I imagine something like 30 years from now, I think that quite a lot of cultural change can happen around money as this technology, you know, all the different approaches to cryptocurrency, but this technology in particular evolves. And so it really does feel feasible to me that we could see, you know, not just significant usage, but like really massive adoption of alternate, stable, non-fiat currencies on a timeline like that. But how would it happen? So the way that I think about it, it's like, imagine a world where dominant fiat currencies, like today the US dollar, do start to have issues. You can imagine individuals starting to hold alternatives as their cash, sort of partially to save, but apart from maybe their equity investment portfolio, just holding something other than dollars as their main sort of liquid store of value. And then you can imagine businesses starting to do that. As a business, you would want to do the same thing. You can imagine institutions actually taking parts of their portfolio that they would have allocated to cash and instead deciding, well, maybe we should put it in this slightly more stable alternative. You could even imagine governments like treasuries and central banks beginning to hold such an asset, such a currency, in place of US dollars or other, euros, other fiat currencies that they tend to hold in reserve, because it might appear to be a better way to preserve their purchasing power. And they care about that just like individuals, just like businesses, just like institutions. And that step, when I think about all this, feels very meaningful to me. If we get to the point where a significant number of governments or central banks are holding a significant portion of their assets in alternate currency that is not fiat-based, that is stable for some other reason, I think that opens up a new possibility that I'll try to describe here, which is when other countries go through currency turmoil, right? When you have a situation where a country goes through hyperinflation, there's always the question of currency substitution. Should the government of that country decide to actually just wholesale substitute their currency for some foreign currency? And for example, in Ecuador, the US dollar is used as just the normal currency because the government at some point officially decided to do that currency substitution. Well, if we're to the point where governments and central banks are holding this currency or one or many of these alternate currencies to preserve their own value, that really legitimizes them quite a lot. And so I can imagine in that scenario it being a much more natural choice to actually choose to substitute a failing currency with a stable cryptocurrency instead of substituting with another fiat currency like the US dollar. There's potentially a benefit of political neutrality with a currency that's managed in a decentralized way, but it also just might be a better bet financially in terms of long-term stability for your economy and for your citizens to choose something that is stable independent of any other country's monetary policy. So when I think about that world where we really get to massive adoption, I think that really feels like a plausible and important step. And again, obviously I'm just sharing my perspective. This is all just my personal speculation. But when I think about what motivates me to continue working on that long-term vision of the project and not just the phase one that we've made a lot of progress on, this set of ideas is a big part of why. So then the even larger scale scenario, I just talked about a scenario where countries that have dealt with hyperinflation end up officially adopting stable cryptocurrency as their alternative. But that could happen even in countries that are relatively more stable. In the world where fiat currencies continue to have issues over the course of time, you can imagine a possible outcome where more and more individuals in those classically stable countries and economies end up choosing to use an alternate currency like this. And so if you think about the possible world where the US dollar really takes a nosedive, really has an issue potentially because of a shift in global power and maybe the US dollar losing its reserve status, that's the world where I can actually imagine, my mom who's from the US and lives in the US deciding to switch and use one of these alternate currencies. I mean, maybe my mom's a bad example because she's my mom, so maybe she would try it out before then because of my involvement in this project. But you get the point. That's a scenario where I can imagine ordinary people who wouldn't necessarily have a reason to think about the money that they use or how it is that they store their value, really deciding, okay, I think I'm going to opt for this different thing now. And so when we talk about the idea of potentially eradicating hyperinflation, that's an insane idea, completely eradicating it. Monetary systems are so complicated and hard to get right is it really possible to eradicate the existence of hyperinflation, or at least substantially reduce it? The scenario where I can see that potentially happening is if we get, over a timescale like this, 30 years, maybe even longer, more and more currency substitutions, such that countries that are classically the most unstable end up switching to a stable cryptocurrency and not having to worry so much about monetary policy and not really having much of a risk of going through that type of event again, assuming that that cryptocurrency manages to stay stable. And then if that were to end up happening on an even larger scale in a bunch of countries that were classically stable, you could get to the point where there's just less and less dependency on fiat money throughout the world. And I think that that would really, if it happened, meaningfully reduce the chances of those type of hyperinflationary outcomes that we see. We do see that in, one country every couple years goes through like a really bad monetary crisis like that. And it ebbs and flows, it's not a rule, but it's something that we do see pretty frequently. So that's what we mean when we talk about the objective of actually eradicating hyperinflation, or at least reducing its instance dramatically over the course of the long term. We've decided to deploy the Reserve Protocol as a platform rather than just as a single application. What that means is that the smart contracts that we deploy for the Reserve Protocol are actually factory smart contracts. So that means that you can use them to deploy a new set of smart contracts on your own pretty easily anytime. And what that means is that anyone can deploy a new basket-backed stablecoin that uses the Reserve Protocol anytime they want, without even having to be a particularly technically savvy user. So the analogy that I like to make here is to Uniswap. So Uniswap is so magical in part because anyone can add a new trading pair to Uniswap. And it works with the same mechanism with factory smart contracts. So when you deploy a new pool, a new trading pair on Uniswap, you're actually using the factory smart contracts to create new smart contracts that then exist and are there forever, where that trading pair just exists forever because you chose to deploy it. And last time I checked, there was something like 35,000 pairs that have been deployed on Uniswap. Many of them don't get used, but a lot of them do. And that openness and that ability to explore can allow anyone to deploy a new version of something and see if it catches on. I really love that pattern. We were partially inspired by Hayek, who argued in his book, The Denationalization of Money, that the world would basically be better off if private entities were allowed to create currencies and those currencies were allowed to compete against each other. The basic idea is something like the normal force of capitalist competition for goods and services could also work for currency. And as we were thinking about this, as we were thinking about, okay, how is governance going to work? How is the basket going to work for our sort of one true fiat currency replacement? The more we thought about it, the more we were convinced, well, actually, it seems like it's probably more productive to allow open-ended exploration and competition amongst multiple different alternative currencies. So that's kind of a big reason why we decided to go the direction of deploying the Reserve Protocol as a platform, rather than just as like a single stablecoin or a couple of stablecoins that are sort of hard-coded into the protocol itself. So when somebody deploys a stablecoin with the Reserve Protocol, we call that stablecoin an R token. And an R token on a high level has 4 important components that you need to understand to kind of know what an R token is, how it's different from just any other token. Number 1 is the basket. So an R token, every R token is backed by some basket of other tokens on Ethereum. Number 2 is the set of backup tokens. So when an R token is defined, you have a basket of tokens that actually are the backing at the present moment, but you also have a predefined sort of structured graph of other tokens that can be swapped out on short notice without needing any governance action in the case that any one of the present tokens encounters difficulties. Number 3 is the governance module. So each R token is governed separately from one another. So R tokens don't actually have any sort of umbrella governance mechanism that connects them to each other. Once they're deployed, they're separate and they have separate fates, and then they can be governed in totally different ways. So you could deploy an R token and set the governance address to a single Ethereum account and just govern it in a centralized way. You could set it to a multisig. You could set it to any sort of DAO contract that has any arbitrary amount of complexity in how it aggregates power to control that R token. And then number 4 is the insurance pool. So an R token has an insurance mechanism baked right into the code. And the way that that works is that reserve rights token holders can choose to stake their RSR tokens on any given R token, any given stablecoin that's deployed with the reserve protocol if they want to. And if they do that, then they're offering up their RSR as insurance in the case that there is a default of any one of the collateral tokens that's part of the current basket. But in exchange, they earn whatever portion of that R token's revenue that the governance module has decided to direct to RSR stakers. So you could have an R token that has no revenue available to RSR stakers and thus will have no insurance pool, and that's okay. That's an acceptable way to configure an R token. But we believe that insurance is a useful piece of a basket-backed stablecoin because the types of tokens that you want to put in such a basket often are pegged tokens. They're tokens that are pegged to something else, so there's a way in which their value could unexpectedly decline, and also they could be tokens that come from other DeFi protocols that have some amount of protocol risk baked in. And so both of those layers of risk can be insured with this insurance pool that is backed by RSR token holders who choose to stake on that given stablecoin. And if that's a little confusing, that's okay. There are a lot of details to understand for how those mechanisms fit together. But for now, I just wanted to touch on those basic components so you have in mind that the reserve protocol and each R token is made of those basic pieces. So what is an R token going to look like in practice? Like what kinds of baskets, what kind of stablecoins do we expect to see? Here are 4 example categories that we expect will emerge. The first is the pure fiat-backed R token, and that's just a basket of fiat-backed tokens, right? The simplest one is like RSV that already exists today from the beta version of the Reserve Protocol, which is just, in that case, a basket of 3 US dollar-backed stablecoins, USDC, TrueUSD, and Paxos. But you could easily have a similar basket with Euro tokens or other fiat-backed stablecoins as more currencies become tokenized. Category number 2 is an R token backed by DeFi assets. Not really sure what to call them. Basically tokens that pop out of DeFi protocols when you put in stablecoin. So for example, if you deposit USDC into Compound, you get a token called Compound USDC. And that token you can go back and redeem that with the Compound protocol for the USDC you put in, plus some amount of interest that was earned as your capital was lent out. A similar approach exists with many different DeFi protocols, where you can basically take stablecoins and turn them into a wrapped version of that stablecoin that has some interesting set of properties. And so the R token protocol can be used to aggregate together different sets of those DeFi tokens to get an R token that has interesting properties. Perhaps some yield is baked into the token, or other properties might emerge in the future depending on how DeFi progresses. Category number 3 would be a basket of different fiat-backed assets, right? So you might want an R token that's just dollars, but you might also want an R token that's a mixture of 3 different major fiat currencies. That is a source of potential hedge or stability against the devaluation of any one of those currencies, and that could be trivially put together with any currencies that have been tokenized. And category number 4 is an R token that is not fiat-backed at all. That's simply a basket of tokenized assets that are not attached to any fiat currency. Tokenized precious metals are the main case that exists on-chain today. But these could include commodities and perhaps even equities depending on regulatory frameworks in the future. Let's talk about the steps that have gone in and will go into launching the reserve protocol. So the first step was design, and design started back in 2018 at the time that we published the reserve white paper originally. But we also picked up the design step and spent several more months on design in 2021 as we returned to protocol implementation and wanted to add and modify certain features based on ideas that we had had in the intervening years and new technologies that exist in the world of DeFi. The next step was analysis, and analysis consisted of building out a detailed mathematical model of the protocol in order to reason carefully about how it would work, and in particular, in order to make a clear argument that the insurance mechanism would work as we had imagined. We came out of the analysis phase pretty comfortable that the protocol mechanism should work as designed. The next step is development, and we've been on the development step for several months already, and we're still continuing to develop. The end of the development step is marked by a code freeze, and so the next step is the code freeze and audits. So once we reach a point where we're confident that we don't need to make any more changes to the code before deploying, that's the point when it makes sense to hand the code to external auditors and allow them to review it to look for any bugs that our team might have missed. Only after audits will it make sense to go to the next step, which is the actual protocol launch. And at that point, we will also be deploying a UI for people to interact with the new functions of the reserve protocol. After the protocol launch, we plan on running two steps in parallel. One is teaching the community how to deploy our tokens, and the other is running a bug bounty. And for anybody who doesn't know, a bug bounty is simply an offer of cash to any white hat hackers who can find any sort of problem with the code once it's already live. After the code has been live for long enough, under the conditions of a bug bounty, then it will make sense for the team to declare a sort of all clear state. Basically saying, okay, we are now confident enough that it makes sense, we're willing to endorse people locking up very significant value with the reserve protocol by minting a much larger supply of our tokens. And it's at that point, or after that all clear point, when we think it makes sense for our tokens to begin getting listed. So when it comes to listing on centralized exchanges and broader usage of our tokens, it's really that all clear point that we're excited to reach as soon as we possibly can. And I want to make a distinction between our token listings and RSR listings, because those two are not the same thing. So obviously exchanges already list RSR, and they can continue to choose to do so at any time. That's not really contingent on the timeline for our token listings. So when we talk about that all clear point, it has to do with when these novel R tokens built on this novel protocol will make sense to integrate into the crypto ecosystem and make accessible to many users. But RSR can continue to be listed between now and then if exchanges choose to do so. In the development stage, we're taking an approach called progressive specification. I want to talk about what that is and why we're doing it. It basically means that we're building 3 separate copies of the reserve protocol. We're actually writing 3 separate versions of the code. And I'll talk about what the different versions look like, and then I'll explain why we're doing that. So the first version, which we call prototype 0, is as simple as possible. It's meant to be as easy as possible for programmers to understand, to actually wrap their mind around the logic of how the code works, to hold as many of the pieces in mind at a time as possible, to clearly think about them and be able to tell if the way that we're writing the code might have any sort of unexpected consequences. The second version, which is called prototype 1, is gas optimized, right? So the first version, as simple as possible, doesn't necessarily run well on the Ethereum blockchain. Prototype 1, the second, is optimized for gas. So lots of code changes occur between the first one and the second one in order to make sure that when you actually transact with the protocol on Ethereum, you're not paying more gas than you need to, and to make sure that transactions don't end up taking too much computation to the point where they end up failing. The third version accounts for intricacies with math in Solidity. So basically, it has a bunch of details that are necessary to include to deal with numerical precision. But those details complicate the code significantly, and so does gas optimization. So the reason why we're building all three of these versions is so that our programmers can reason as effectively as possible about the code by looking at that first version, and then come to conclusions about the third version. Well, you might wonder, well, but what if there's a difference between the first version and the second version, or the second version and the third version? The way that that's handled is through a set of structured tests that automatically run tons and tons of pretend transactions to check and see if the different systems are sufficiently equivalent. And so it's that equivalence testing that's done in an automated way with a framework of tests that have been written for that purpose that allow us to be quite confident that the way that the first version works and the way that the third version works are sufficiently equivalent within certain small barriers, or small margins of error, because the ways that you handle math in the different ones are slightly different, things like that. But basically it means that if there are bugs in that third version where the code is really complicated, you could actually notice those issues. You could notice those strange behaviors by looking at the much simpler code in the first version. And so for a protocol as complex as the reserved protocol, this is, we believe, the right method to make sure that we're implementing it correctly. As you can imagine, this development approach takes a lot of time. So we've been in development for several months already, and our estimate for the launch timeline for the protocol is getting pushed back. We previously estimated we'd reach code freeze in early or late December. And that would have put us on a launch timeline of late December or sometime in January. But we've encountered some steps that have taken longer than planned, and those have changed our estimates. And I want to explain some examples. I want people to actually understand what is it that we've encountered and why do we think it makes sense to push that timeline back. So the first example is we recently completed a refactoring of the code that was unexpected. What do I mean by that? So we took a piece of the protocol that was coded up in 2 smart contracts, and we broke that down into 10 smart contracts instead of 2. And we did that because we realized that when the code was just in those 2 smart contracts for that part of the protocol, it was hard to think clearly about it, and it was hard to check it for certain kinds of issues that can really only be checked by thinking about it as a human, something that's, the sorts of things that don't get picked up by automated tests. And so by breaking it down into more parts, down into 10 contracts, it actually makes each piece simpler and easier to think about, and that actually has worked. So we've already discovered some subtle things that would have been very difficult to notice before undergoing that refactoring. But we didn't realize, a month or 2 ago that this particular refactoring would be necessary. So that was time that we hadn't budgeted for. The second example is that we realized we had a need to update our approach to testing, including swapping out one of the tools we use for tests. Why is that? It's basically because the normal way of doing tests and what's called fuzz testing, which is basically when a testing framework is automatically throwing lots of inputs at a piece of software to check and see what happens. The normal way of doing that would not have explored all of the paths in our code. And so we ended up having to try out a few other toolkits and choose a new one in order to make our tests more thorough. And this has led to actually a 2x increase in the total amount of Solidity code in our repository, not in the protocol contracts themselves, but in additional testing code that's written in Solidity because of the way that that new framework works. And again, we're happy about this update. We actually feel better about the overall testing framework because we took the time to do that. But again, this was something that we didn't realize in advance that we would need to make that change mid-development cycle. The third is something that hasn't happened yet, but it's something that we've realized we're going to need to do at the time of deployment. And this adds a little bit of time to the overall timeline. So we're going to need to deploy a new RSR contract for the protocol launch, which we've known all along. But as we've thought it through, we've realized that it probably makes sense to deploy that new RSR contract and then wait some period of time before then deploying the new reserve protocol. Part of that is just to give it some time to make sure that there's no issues with the new RSR contract. The next reason is to make sure that exchanges and wallets are all updated to that new contract address, because it'd be unfortunate to have confusion about which contract address to use for RSR right at the point of the protocol launch. And the third is that we'd like to get that new RSR token with the new contract address added to Aave by the point of the protocol deployment, because that will simplify a little piece of the protocol and how we deal with price feeds for RSR itself. So those are three sort of concrete examples of the kinds of things that come up when you're in a development stage for a project like this. And those are things that have recently come up and have caused us to push back the timeline for when we're expecting to launch the protocol. Our updated estimate for when we'll reach code freeze is in late February or sometime in March. And that means protocol deployment sometime in March or even in April. And so it could end up being faster than that. It could be that the remaining development steps take less time than we're now budgeting. It could end up taking longer than that, even. As you have seen from the examples that I just shared, these things can be hard to predict. And with this kind of critical infrastructure development, if a step presents itself that you didn't think about, but you realize it's necessary, you kind of just have to do it. And so that is what's happened to us recently. And we're doing our best to take that into account as we update this estimate. You always try to do that when you're estimating development timelines. You always add time for unexpected things to pop up, but we've increased the amount of unexpected things that we think could still pop up in the final stages of development. And so we're already trying to bake that in, and that's why it could end up being shorter than that, could end up happening faster, but there's also a chance that it could end up taking longer. And I know that for some of you watching this video, that won't really matter. The exact timeline doesn't necessarily matter to you. What is a couple of months for a project that has been so long in the making? But I also know that for some people watching this video, that really is going to matter. People really do care a lot about that timeline, and I understand why. I do understand why. The thing that I want to try to get across about why we're running the project this way and why we're willing to take on delays like this is just that it's essential. We are, as I described earlier in this video, we're aiming quite high in terms of the significance of what this technology is meant to ultimately support. And so getting it right, we feel, is really, really important. So getting the design right, getting the architecture right, and making sure that there are no bugs in the implementation so that when we launch this version of the reserve protocol, it doesn't end up developing a reputation of being flawed, or it doesn't fail to work in some important way. We think that that's really crucial for setting the protocol up for a chance at real success. So we'll look at these economics by examining two different scenarios. So in this first scenario, you can see by looking at this diagram that we have 4 times as much RSR staked as the market cap of the R token that it's staked on. So this is a possible early days scenario where you have an R token that's really small in terms of market cap, and you have lots of RSR holders, and a bunch of them decide to stake because why not? And so you sort of overwhelm the R token market cap with the value of the staked RSR. So here we're showing a 4x multiple in terms of the RSR staked on the R token. So imagine that the R token is offering staking rewards that are equal to 2.5% of the market cap of that R token. That's a plausible number. But because you have 4 times the amount of value staked, you have to divide that value by 4 to get the annual earnings for RSR stakers. So you'd only be getting 0.625% in that scenario. You can see that that's not a very interesting amount of money to earn for staking your RSR. So you might expect some RSR to be unstaked at a rate like that. Now let's look at another scenario. This might be more plausible in a later stage if an R token becomes more popular, because the R token could end up having significantly higher market cap. So here we're showing what it would look like if you have 1/4 instead of 4x the amount of RSR value staked on this R token. And there the math goes in the other direction. So if the R token is paying 2.5% of its market cap to the RSR stakers, you multiply that by 4 instead of dividing by 4. And so the stakers would be earning 10% on their capital on an annual basis. Now there's a further nuance we can look at with scenario 2 here, which is, suppose that you purchase that RSR early on, and suppose that you purchase it for 1/10 the price that it ends up being at a late stage when you end up staking it. Well, in that case, the return on capital, maybe it's 10% for the value of the capital that you're putting to work by staking your RSR at that later stage, but that could be 100% return per year on the capital that you spent to purchase the RSR at the beginning. And obviously, I'm not here to make a prediction that RSR is going to go up 10x in price. Maybe that will happen, but maybe it won't. RSR obviously could also go down in price, and in that case, the math would go in the other direction. But I think that this dynamic is worth keeping in mind. When we're thinking about the long-term economics of the protocol, this is something that we take into account in our model. And as I mentioned, in the analysis phase, the protocol team built out a relatively detailed mathematical model to understand all of these nuances. So we actually have a formula where we can think about the value of the insurance pool, the value of all of the staking rewards for a particular R token in perpetuity into the future. And this formula actually displays that value. This is something that we haven't published yet because we have to be very careful about how we do so. We need to make sure that we're not making price predictions about RSR and we're letting others come to their own assessments of that question. But we're going to publish our mathematical analysis. We just have to make sure that we do it right. So that's a document that you can look forward to coming out sometime soon before the launch of the Mainnet protocol. On a high level, staking rewards are required in order to incentivize RSR holders to offer insurance to an R token. And I believe personally that they'll also in the long term be required to incentivize RSR holders to engage in governance. In the early version of governance that we think is going to be common amongst R tokens, there won't be any incentive to participate as a governor, but we believe in the long term that it may be the case that incentivization is necessary for productive participation in governance. So it's really those two forces fundamentally that mean that RSR holders will probably have the opportunity to earn money by staking their RSR and participating in governance in the future. The amount that they'd be able to earn is contingent, though, on the market cap of R tokens, whether or not R tokens get popular. And that's something that can't be predicted in advance. Maybe that will happen, maybe that won't happen. We'll have to wait and see whether the market is excited about R tokens, about the way that they work, about the baskets that the community comes up with, and the different R tokens that get deployed. I'm excited about this approach to staking because of how real it is. What do I mean by that? There's two things I actually mean by that. Number one, the term staking these days often is abused. We say staking just to mean putting tokens into some smart contract. But you're often not actually putting them at stake. You're not actually risking them being taken away from you or being slashed, as was the case and is the case in proof-of-stake protocols. These days, staking is often just a mechanism to incentivize people to lock up their tokens so that they don't sell them. And that's often part of some sort of short-term scheme to cause a token to be more valuable, maybe so that the founders can cash out or what have you. The other thing I mean is that the rewards that are present in this staking mechanism are coming from value that the protocol has actually provided to the world. So in that example of 2.5% of the R token market cap being available to stakers, that's coming from the fact that the R token has, for example, lent out the underlying collateral to borrowers who are willing to pay for that service. So that's a sustainable long-term revenue mechanism that this autonomous set of smart contracts can execute. And that differs from the source of staking rewards in many DeFi protocols today, which is just a newly invented token that has come out into the market recently and has some market value, maybe because of some hype, that's being handed out to people who've just chosen to lock up their tokens. And so these two things are really not the same, and they will behave differently over the course of time as well. This common pattern of staking, I want to say staking with air quotes, that exists in DeFi today is something where you'll see large returns at the beginning, but then as that token that's paying for it all gets handed out, or as interest in that token wanes and the value goes down over the course of time, which could happen, then those rewards will reduce over time and people will just move on. Whereas with this mechanism that's built into the Reserve protocol, if it works, if our tokens get popular, and that's only if our tokens get popular, then the staking rewards will go up and up and up over the course of time, instead of having a large sort of fanfare at the beginning and then just going away and everybody moving on. So this really is built to make sense for the long term and to be economically sound in the long term. And one thing I think is really cool about this mechanism, and the fact that it really only works super well for RSR holders if our tokens get popular, is that it puts the incentives in the right place for RSR holders as a whole. It incentivizes them to do what's needed as a community to make good art tokens and to get those art tokens into circulation and to make them popular, to provide important value to the world in line with the vision of the Reserve project. In the long term, that is really what's going to cause RSR to be something you can use to earn significant amounts of money. And the community will have to do a lot of work to make that happen. And that's in contrast to the incentives to just shill in the short term, which often arise with these other sorts of DeFi staking protocols that have become popular of late. So again, I know this is a long-term approach to things, and that's not what a lot of people in crypto want. Some people in crypto are excited about long-term things. Some people in crypto are not. This is a long-term mechanism, and it was designed that way intentionally. And if it works, it will really work, and it'll be really awesome. But it's not the sort of thing where there's an enormous amount of free money being handed out over a short number of months. There's lots of opportunities for that elsewhere. That's not the thing that this project is offering. And finally, I have some good news to share about how the RSR unlocking process is going to work around the mainnet launch. And it's good news, I think, for all parties. I think it's good news for current unlocked RSR holders, and I also think it's good news for locked RSR holders. So I'll explain the whole thing, but the TLDR is that we'll be working with one of the top OTC desks to add order to the unlocking process. And what that means is that RSR sales that happen during the unlocking process, in many cases, will be routed through an OTC desk rather than being done haphazardly on exchanges in ways that could cause problems for the order of the RSR market. Okay, so let me explain how this is going to work. First, I have to give a little bit of background for what the challenge is here. So fundamentally, the challenge is the risk of competitive selling. So if you imagine that you're a locked RSR holder and you're just beginning to receive these tokens that you've been waiting maybe many years to get, and maybe you want some liquidity. Maybe you don't want to sell all of your RSR, but you want to sell some of it, maybe even just a little bit of it. You're going to start to think about okay, well, how's this going to play out? Well, if other people sell their RSR, that might start to drive the price down. So maybe that means I should try to sell as soon as possible so that I can get a better price if the price might be driven down if other people sell. But then if a lot of people think that way, then that causes everyone to sort of start to think in competition with each other and start to think about maybe rushing to try to sell first, but then someone else has to rush more to sell before that person, and so on. And it can get people into a mindset potentially of competitive selling and sort of rushing to sell, and it can stop them from being thoughtful about how they do any selling that they do. Because there's ways to sell that affect the market price in a negative way, significantly, and there's other ways to sell that probably have much less of a market impact. But if you're in that competitive selling mindset and you're just trying to do it as quickly as possible, you won't necessarily be very careful about it. Another part of the challenge is that we set up an unlocking schedule back at the very beginning of the project. So we have many people and companies and investment funds and so on that have contracts with that schedule in it. And so those parties are entitled to that particular schedule that we agreed to. We counted the other day and it's 297 different parties. And that includes our early backers, everyone who's ever been on the Reserve team, everyone who's ever been an advisor to Reserve, and several companies who provided service to Reserve to the project in exchange for tokens along the way. And so if you were to come up with some alternate unlocking schedule, it'd be very difficult to get 297 parties, 100% of them, to agree to that new schedule. But the problem there is, let's say you had a new schedule that stretched out the unlocking over a longer period of time. Well, if only 10 or 15% of the parties don't agree to that new schedule, now they have an unfair advantage over everybody else. And that leads to a situation where people won't want to accept that new schedule because they can tell, well, maybe some other parties won't. And so it makes it difficult to switch from one approach to a different approach. So the solution that we've come up with to this problem is to offer locked RSR holders an alternate option that is both better for them personally, if they choose it, and if they choose it, actually improves the dynamics for everybody else involved. And so that way, you're not having to choose between something that's better for the collective but worse for you, or something that's better for you and worse for the collective. We think that we've come up with an option that's better for you and better for the collective, including other locked RSR holders and unlocked RSR holders out in the market. This particular solution that I'm about to describe also doesn't depend on 100% of parties opting into it. Even if half of parties or 75% or 95% opt in, all of that is significant improvement. The more people opt in, the better it is for overall market conditions. I personally think that most or maybe even all parties will end up opting in, but even if that doesn't happen, that's totally okay. The way that this is going to work is that locked RSR holders will be given two options. Option one is to make a modification to their contract and be subject to slightly different rules. And option two is to stick with the original agreement. So let's look at option one. In option one, tokens begin unlocking in the first week of January, so significantly before the protocol deployment actually happens. And the unlocking schedule is roughly the same, still over the course of 6 months, with a slight difference, which is that there isn't 10% available unlocked on day one. So it's just a linear unlocking over the course of 6 months. But the main difference is that tokens aren't quite unlocked in the same way. If the locked token holder chooses to sell the RSR tokens that are unlocking, they can only do that through the OTC desk that we're working with for this operation. The way that this works is that the RSR tokens, when they're unlocking, are actually still held by the Reserve project team. And so if a locked token holder chooses to sell some of those tokens, it's up to the project team to actually facilitate sending those tokens to the OTC desk to sell. And that guarantees that all sales will go through that channel. The OTC desk can then clear those transactions by matching them with OTC buyers, if there are OTC buyers on that day. And if there aren't, they can clear the transaction by passively selling on exchanges in a careful way. This OTC desk is very experienced with this kind of transaction, so they know how to do that kind of selling carefully and passively, and they will place significant limits on the amount that can be sold per day. So it's not just the mechanism, it's also the total volume that can possibly be sold by all parties involved. And that's possible to do because it goes through just this one channel. So their rule of thumb is not to sell more than 3% of the daily trading volume, which, as you can see, is a pretty small percentage of the total transactions in the market. So you can see how that basic mechanism can significantly limit any market impact, even if they do passively sell on exchanges in order to clear those transactions. This places limits on the amount of RSR that a locked RSR holder can choose to sell on any given day or any given week. So in a sense, it is restricting them more, but this option also allows them to start getting liquidity sooner. And so we believe that it is a better option for a holder that's looking for liquidity. And also you can tell that if you're getting liquidity in this earlier phase, you're not pitted against other sellers who you have to compete against. It's all orderly and it's all fair. And so it totally takes away that anxiety and that potential desire to try to competitively sell. So we totally get rid of that dynamic for any sales that happen through this mechanism. At the end of the unlocking period, recipients then just receive all remaining RSR that they didn't choose to sell through that mechanism. And that's not very risky because you can tell at that point that that's RSR that they didn't have any desire to sell. If they had had a desire to sell it, they already would have submitted it for a sale through that mechanism. So if you wait long enough, then you can hand over that unlocked RSR and not have any concern about the impact on the market. Option 2 is again to stick with the original delivery schedule, the thing that everyone is entitled to with their current contracts. So if a participant chooses option 2, then they'll receive their tokens beginning at the Mainnet protocol launch. They'll get 10% on day 1 and 90% over the course of 6 months. And those tokens will be delivered directly to them for them to do whatever they want with. So if a token holder doesn't have a plan to sell any RSR, then they wouldn't necessarily have an incentive to, read the details and go through with the contract change because it doesn't really matter to them. But if they're not planning to sell any of their RSR, then it doesn't really matter to the rest of the market what they do either. It doesn't really matter what their unlocking mechanism is. So let me talk a little bit about why I think this is better for both types of token holders, the unlocked RSR holders and the locked RSR holders. For unlocked RSR holders, I think this is better because I think that it's going to lead to a more orderly marketplace, in summary. And there's one thing to note though, which is that this does involve unlocking RSR tokens prior to the point of protocol launch. And so you might have the concern of, well, if tokens are unlocking at the point of the protocol launch, then maybe those people with tokens that are unlocking would then choose to stake them rather than selling them. However, if you think about it, I think that because of the way that RSR staking economics work, what really matters a lot more is the token holder's expectation of the ability to stake in the long term because of the way that the rewards will look in the short term versus the long term, which I covered earlier in this video. So because of that, I think the moment of mainnet launch and the fact that initial staking will be available won't be a significant force determining whether a locked RSR holder chooses to hold or to sell. The second reason I think it's positive is that releasing a significant chunk of tokens right on the day of mainnet launch seems risky to me, right? In the current agreement, token holders are entitled to receiving 10% of the tokens that are going to be unlocked on the day of the mainnet launch. But I don't want the day of the mainnet launch to be a risky or anxiety-filled day. I don't want it to be a volatile day. I want it to be a purely positive and celebratory day. So by stretching out the tokens that would have been released on that day a little bit sooner and keeping everything more orderly, then I think that there's a good chance that the day of the mainnet launch will be more of a celebratory day than a day that we have to bite our nails over. So those are kind of two reasons why I think it is a positive change, even if you might be worried about the release of tokens starting a little bit before the point of mainnet protocol deployment. I think this is also positive for the locked RSR holder because it will take the stress and competitive dynamics out of the situation. And for anyone who does want some liquidity, you may get a better price because the market will be in a more orderly condition. Obviously, I can't make price predictions, and maybe that's not true, but in a macro sense, in a structural sense, it seems like a likely improvement to the circumstance. That's at least the motivation for doing this. So if you're a locked RSR holder, I wholeheartedly encourage you to choose option 1. I do think it's better for you, and I think it's better for the collective overall. But at the end of the day, it's your choice. And if you choose not to, that's also totally fine. I'm not here to try to pressure anyone into taking an option that's not the best for them. I'm really pleased with this approach. I'm happy to be able to offer an option that I think is better for everybody involved. And if you have any further questions about this, especially as an RSR holder out in the community, feel free to tag me on Twitter with your questions, and I'll answer in public just in case anyone else is wondering the same thing as you. Thanks for watching this update video on the state of the Reserve project. We talked about some things we've accomplished up until now, some of the pieces we're working on at the moment, with this big milestone coming up of our full protocol launch, and some of at least my imagination of what the future could possibly look like. I hope you found it informative. And thank you for being a part of the Reserve project. Like, if you're here watching this video, especially all the way to the end, like, you're part of what we're doing. And I have so much appreciation for, like, from the very beginning, from the early teammates and advisors who helped us out, to our early backers who helped us kind of get the project off the ground, and to the team that we've built now. This is very different from our early team. So many people who are so passionate about making stable currency universally accessible. And to our RSR holders, to everybody out there who is a part of what we're doing. Just by holding that token, that's already being a part of what we're doing in an economic sense. And, so many people participate on Twitter and in Telegram and in other ways in, spreading information about what we're doing and thinking about how it could be done better. I get a lot of messages from people on how to do things differently, or just like random ideas of like, I don't know if this makes sense, but have you thought about this? Have you thought about this place? Have you talked to people in this place, etc.? So I just, at the beginning of the project, never would have imagined how much energy would end up pouring into it from so many different people all around the world. And I really, really appreciate that. So thank you for being a part of the project. And I'll see you next time on perhaps a future update like this.